On the grounds of the Israel Museum, this limestone model of 1st century Jerusalem enables visitors to retrace events that changed the world. By merging this impressive model, built on a scale of 1 to 50, with the streets of modern Jerusalem, Mart De Haan and Jimmy DeYoung will follow Jesus, event by event, place to place, to Easter Sunday and beyond. Behind the Easter story, retracing the footsteps of Jesus from his betrayal to his resurrection and disappearance in the sky on this day of discovery.
The first two religious trials would have taken place in the upper city in the home of Caiaphas the high priest. And then the religious leaders would have brought Jesus here to Antonio's fortress, to Pilate's judgment hall, where the Roman soldiers would have held Jesus Christ. We go to Pilate's judgment hall and Mart De Haan.
Over the centuries, Jerusalem has been rebuilt many times. So today, to come down to street level near the time of Christ, in the area of Antonia's fortress, we have to come down at least 30 feet below the present day street level. Here, let's take a closer look. These paving stones take us back near to the time of Jesus, and they reflect the Roman occupation. Archaeologists point out a game carved into the stone, the kind of game that the Roman soldiers would have played to pass time. In fact, we're told that the Roman soldiers cast lots for the clothing of Jesus. And together it reminds us of the kind of suffering that Jesus endured at their hands.
Pilate took Jesus and scourged him, and the soldiers twisted a crown of thorns and put it on his head, and they put on him a purple robe. Then they said, "Hail, King of the Jews!" and they struck him with their hands. Pilate then went out again and said to them, "Behold, I am bringing him out to you, that you may know that I find no fault in him." Then Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, and Pilate said to them, "Behold the man." Therefore, when the chief priests and officers saw him, they cried out, saying, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" Pilate said to them, "You take him and crucify him, for I find no fault in him." John chapter 19.
Many of us who have read the Gospels and historical accounts have found ourselves cringing at the injustice of the crucifixion of Jesus the innocent. But that cup of suffering would open the door to God's offer of salvation. Now try to imagine this model in the streets of Jerusalem filled with people from Israel and beyond celebrating the annual Jewish feast of Passover or Pesach. It's from the context of this ancient holiday that Jesus reaches across the centuries to us. According to the New Testament, it would be by his own suffering and death that he became our Passover sacrifice.
After being beaten by the Roman soldiers at Antonia's fortress, there at Pilate's judgment hall, the Roman soldiers would have given Jesus to the religious leaders, and they would have led him outside the wall of the city, through one of the 7 gates of the city, to the location of the crucifixion.
Here's a perspective of how Jerusalem has changed over the years. Just below the Damascus Gate is Hadrian's Gate, dates from 135 AD. That shows how much Jerusalem's been built up over the years. Now, we don't know for sure exactly where Jesus was crucified, but one thing we do know, it was outside of the city walls. Execution could not have taken place in the holy city of Jerusalem.
And he, bearing his cross, went out to a place called the Place of a Skull, which is called in Hebrew Golgotha, where they crucified him, and 2 others with him, one on either side, and Jesus in the center. John chapter 19.
When we're trying to determine the location of the crucifixion of Jesus Christ, today there are three traditional sites. Just outside the walls of the city there, to the west of the temple, would be the first site where today stands the Holy Sepulchre. Coming out of the Damascus Gate and to the north of the Temple Mount and Antonio's fortress would be where this outcropping of rocks is located. That's Gordon's Calvary. And I believe personally that the death, the burial, and the resurrection of Jesus Christ would have taken place on the Mount of Olives. There where you can see across the Kidron Valley is the observation place where we stood overlooking the city. Right now we join Mart at Gordon's Calvary, just north of the Temple Mount, an ideal setting to remember the death, the burial, and the resurrection of Jesus Christ.
When evening had come, there came a rich man from Arimathea named Joseph, who himself had also become a disciple of Jesus. This man went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. Then Pilate commanded the body to be given to him. When Joseph had taken the body, he wrapped it in a clean linen cloth and laid it in his new tomb, which he had hewn out of the rock. And he rolled a large stone against the door of the tomb and departed. Matthew chapter 27.
Ken, what are the characteristics of the garden tomb that parallel the New Testament account?
Well, we start off with the very fact, before we have the resurrection, we've got to have the crucifixion. And just outside this garden, before the garden in here was recognized as being a possibility of Joseph of Arimathea's garden, outside there was great excitement that they'd found Calvary or Golgotha outside the city wall at the grotto of Jeremiah, as one of the theologians said. But there is indeed the place of the skull just outside this garden.
Ken Trustrail is one of the hosts of this popular site, which has been visited by hundreds of thousands over the past century. Not only is the tomb found here similar to the one in which Jesus' body was placed, but a nearby rocky hill has features that look like a human skull. Most archaeologists don't consider this the actual hill of Golgotha, nor do they believe that the tomb here is the one in which Jesus' body was laid. But as Ken explains, the features here give the visitor a feel for the setting described in the Bible.
So we've got in this place here evidence that it was a vineyard 2,000 years ago. The word the New Testament gives us as garden is either a citrus grove, an olive grove, or a vineyard. For sure, this was a vineyard. Joseph's vineyard? Could have been, we can't be sure. But we do know what the tomb was like, and this one matches the bill. For instance, it's got a rolling stone entrance, the only one in the area. And the Bible speaks much of the rolling stone. It's got a large weeping or wailing chamber where the folk would mourn for the dead. Joseph was a rich man. He would have had a large weeping chamber. And then most interestingly of all, as far as I'm concerned, on the right-hand side of the entrance, we find the graves, and only one has been completed. And Mark in his gospel says that Joseph gave to Jesus a new tomb, and he tells us that it was on the right that the angel was sitting. So it fits in. Everything is as it should be. This site is geographically in the right place, outside the city wall, north side of the Temple Mount, where the great and glorious sacrifice got to be made. And there's a garden here, a vineyard, and a tomb with all the right answers. So if it isn't the place it ought to be, but if it isn't the place, it's a brilliant visual aid. But the main thing of all is that death couldn't hold Jesus, that everyone who comes here and looks into this tomb sees the same thing, an empty tomb, because 2,000 years ago or so, Jesus broke the bonds of sin and death and hell and was raised victoriously from the dead. And the message of the garden is very simple. Because Jesus lives, we can live also.